Dr. Suzanne Chod of North Central College. She teaches classes in American political institutions, parties, campaigns, and elections, as well as courses focused on women in American politics and research methods. She is currently the coordinator of the Gender and Sexuality Studies program and a member of the President's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force. Tonight, Dr. Chod will talk about the advantages and complexities of adopting ranked choice voting in the electoral system. Topics will include how ranked choice voting can increase voter representation, promote consensus, and decrease the wasted vote approach of voters. She will also address the logistical hurdles, voter confusion, and the structural changes required for successful ranked choice voting implementation. Just to be perfectly clear, the League of Women Voters of Naperville has no position, pro or con, on whether or not ranked choice voting would be a good option for our community. This is an educational program for all of us. Dr. Chod?
Hi, good evening. It's so nice to be here. I want to thank you all for the invitation. Ranked choice voting is a complicated topic with a lot of moving parts. And so I really, again, I appreciate being asked to go over some of the details and intricacies of it. Susan and I talked earlier about, and we both agree about this being kind of a more relaxed type format. So I do have a presentation with some information. I'll talk about all the things that Susan mentioned and look forward to conversation as well as we move through the presentation. So I'm going to apologize for kind of the logistical weirdness that's about to happen. I'm going to share my screen so we can see the presentation. So if you just give me one moment and make sure that this is working okay. And I'm hoping everyone can see what's on the screen. If you can't, please somebody give me a heads up and let me know. Okay. All right. So as Susan mentioned, so the title of my talk for tonight is, well, that I will say here, is it for you exploring the benefits and challenges of ranked choice voting in the United States? So obviously this is something that's been circulating around Naperville and the conversations about whether it's going to be implemented or not. And there are lots of places around the country where this has been implemented, where it's going to be, where there's pushback where it already has been. And there's and we'll talk about Alaska as an example of an initiative to try to undo the implementation of ranked choice voting. And so what we're going to do, what I will be doing tonight, so again, hopefully this is all working now, is start with the discussion of what is ranked choice voting. And so the different types, kind of the way that it works. A lot of you, of course, are probably already familiar, but I'm just going to go over it a little bit quickly, just so we can make sure we're on the same page. And then I'll begin with, I don't know why, again, this isn't, oh, excuse me. I'm having some trouble here with this working. There we go. Sorry about that. Talking about the pros of adopting ranked choice voting. And what I'll be doing as I talk about the pros and actually about the challenges is that I'll be doing a little bit of myth busting in between. So there are some things where I'll say like, okay, here's something that people say is a pro of adopting it, but the research may not bear that out completely. And the same thing with challenges. So I'll be doing a little bit of both of, yes, these things really are pros of it, and the data suggests that's the case, and the same thing with the challenges, or where there's a little bit of myth busting there. And then again, there might be some questions as I move along, but I reserve some time hopefully at the end for questions after we go through all of the information. Okay, so I'll start with what is ranked choice voting. So rather than using candidates as examples, I love colors. I think this is a really nice and clear, ABC News put this together through 538. It's a nice graphic of how this works. So the way that we vote right now is what we call first past the post, or single vote. You might hear it also called plurality, where you just pick the candidate you like and you just vote for them. But of course, in a ranked choice voting, you would rank all of the candidates. Your first choice, you would put 1, and then you would rank all of the candidates on the ballot, 2, 3, 4, 5, and down the line. In a ranked choice voting system, you are not required to rank every candidate. And I can talk about that a little bit more, especially as the pros and cons, but typically you would rank the candidates in order of your preference 1 to however many candidates there are. And the thing about this is that, okay, if one of the candidates, in this case, orange, gets more than a majority of the vote, then that candidate, or in this case, that color, wins. And so rather than having a plurality, which is that the candidate or color gets the most votes, which is how we do it, if this were a case, and then we would have to go to a second round if we were in a ranked choice voting model. If you get an out more than 50% the first time, then there's the winner, and there's no second tabulation of votes. Typically, this is not the case in a ranked choice voting system. We do go to the second round at least. But in the case that one of the candidates, or orange in this case, the color, gets 50%, more than 50%, then we're done and we don't need to go to the next tabulation. But if there isn't a majority after the first round, then what we do is, as it says here, we would play sort of this redistribution game. So whomever had voted for pink in this case, because pink got the least amount of votes, pink is now out. And then let's say I put pink first, but I put purple second, then my vote gets distributed to purple, right? And so after all the second place votes of anyone who put pink first gets tabulated onto the remaining colors. And in this case, we see here in the second round, no one has reached 50% yet. So now we would move along one more time. Again, excuse me, here we go. We would move along one more time. Here we see pink is eliminated and redistributed, as I just mentioned. And then here, once now purple's knocked out, then whoever had purple first, those second place votes get redistributed. And then in this case now, teal has won because teal got 55% of the vote. Teal happens to be one of my favorite colors, so I was pretty excited about that as the example there. Now, the thing about this process is that in the case of most ranked choice voting systems, this happens immediately, right? And so this is what we call the instant runoff voting. So rather than having multiple elections where, you know, let's say pink was eliminated and so there's a second election, and there are some states that do a runoff system where you have 2 sets of elections. This typically in a ranked choice voting system, at least the ones implemented across the US so far, this happens immediately. So the tabulation happens immediately. It does take a little bit longer to count the votes. It does take a certain amount of training for those who are implementing the election, but it all happens instantly or immediately. And this will continue to go on, particularly depending on the number of candidates, until one of the candidates gets more than 50% of the vote. Okay. And so because I'm sharing a screen, I can't see anyone. And so Susan, if there are questions, please just, get off mute and stop me because I can't see anybody. But I'm going to keep going. And if there are questions that I need to answer, please just flag me down and I will answer them. Okay, so what I wanted to show here is where is ranked choice voting already happening in the United States? It's changing pretty rapidly, and this is just a very general map because within the states, you can also look at cities and municipalities specifically that are using it. But there's a couple of things I just wanted to note here. So the dark green here, where you see Alaska and Hawaii, and then we see Maine up at the top in the corner. This is where we see most of the ranked choice voting happening for statewide elections. So almost every election in those states is using ranked choice voting. And there's some things that are unique about those states that I'll mention as we move along. And then you can see with the darker shade of teal and lighter shade of teal, where we've got, and like Illinois, for example, which I'll talk about in a minute, where some local elections will use ranked choice voting. But I want to note that there are a handful of states that have voted to ban ranked choice voting in the state. There are some things that those states have in common. Again, I'll mention that as we move along a little bit later. But we can see that most of the country at this point still does not use ranked choice voting, nor have they taken a position on whether they should implement it or not. There may be a discussion about it, but nothing has been implemented in terms of either having it or in the case of those gray states where it's been banned. Of course, Illinois, where we are here, we know that there have been some outside of Naperville that's considering it, that there's been some other cities in Illinois that have already adopted it for subsequent elections who are talking about it, because we do have the ability to do so. And so I want to focus, Rebecca Williams from Fair Vote, Illinois, and I know that someone from Fair Vote gave a presentation for y'all earlier. I'm not sure if it was her or not, but she's been a huge proponent in Illinois of getting ranked choice voting adopted. And one of the things that she has said in pretty much every interview that she gives is talking about Naperville specifically, in fact. The residents here seem to quickly understand the concept of ranked choice voting and appreciate the idea of having more choices when they vote. And this is typically what we hear when people are talking about the adoption of it is, yes, it's complicated, but we can understand it if we're educated about it. And once we understand that we can vote for maybe candidates that typically we wouldn't think of before that could win, and there be more consensus built, that we like it. And so I do want to focus on those two things pretty extensively tonight. First, this idea of more choice, which is something that those who want to adopt ranked choice voting really put at the top of the list of why they like it. But the understanding part needs some attention as well, because it is complicated. Anything that's different than what we're used to is complicated. And so it takes a lot of education and iterative education to get us to understand it. And when the stakes are super high and fast-paced for an election, that can be a challenge. So those are the two things that I want to focus on as we go through the pros and cons of the presentation. So I want to start with what are, sorry about that. I want to start with what are the pros, because we'll start with that first. Excuse me, one second again. I'm sorry about a little finicky. Here we go. One of the main pros that we hear about is the idea of a consensus candidate. So because a candidate, in order to be elected, has to win more than 50% of the vote, the idea is that there is a consensus among the electorate, even if they weren't their first choice, maybe they were the second or they were the third choice, that this is a candidate that we would be comfortable serving. And so this is a candidate that has the strongest support. And this is absolutely accurate, right? In terms of what consensus means, or this idea of strongest support, that because a candidate would get more than 50%, that would require people to have ranked that candidate second. And so second would maybe mean they were okay with that candidate. And so as we get and move through to the 50%, that this would be someone that more voters would feel comfortable serving. And so they have the strongest support. That's a better type of representation, because maybe every voter, or at least most, feels like there's something about that candidate that would represent them well. And so that is one of the things that we hear pretty consistently, this idea of having the consensus candidate. The other thing about it, which I find to be pretty persuasive in terms of at least where the data lie, is that for a lot of voters, when they are exposed to ranked choice voting, either they do it or they're told about it, they have an increased faith in the legitimacy of our electoral system and process. So one of the things that we know very, very clearly right now is that there is a lack of faith and trust in the political system. And while this was happening before 2017, we have seen, especially since 2021, a stark decrease in the faith of the system, a trust in the system, and thinking that it's a legitimate way, that our electoral institutions are legitimate. And so the data are really interesting. The research is really interesting looking at this. And so there's three things I want to highlight. The first is that there's some evidence that suggests that ranked choice voting actually narrows the gap between informed and uninformed voters. So because you can vote for more than one candidate, there's an inclination to do more research, because you can't just use the party as a cue, only Republican or only Democrat. It's like voting in a primary within a party, right? You really have to know about the candidates. And so for those who typically are not informed about the issues or the positions of candidates, that they are likely to have more information. And so it can narrow this gap between informed and uninformed voters. And that's a pretty large gap. And so that's something that ranked choice voting can provide, is a shrinking of the gap between those types of voters. The second thing, and this is the term we use a lot in political science, is efficacy. There's two types. We have this external efficacy, which is that you feel like the system, it works. It is legitimate and it does what it is supposed to do. You have faith in it. And our external efficacy is quite low right now. But what the data suggests is that ranked choice voting, for voters who vote in a ranked choice voting system, it actually affects their attitudes about the legitimacy of the system. It increases it. It can increase that efficacy to feel like the system is working for you and is serving you and is fair and just, which is something that definitely has been lacking in the past couple of years, if not longer. And the final thing is what we talk about in terms of policy matching. And so because in the first past the post or plurality system, we have these two parties, you use your party queue, you vote for one party or the other, and you don't really have to do a lot of research about what the candidates stand for. And once they serve, there may be a lack of matching of the policies that they're proponents of or how they're behaving on your behalf because they know you're going to vote for them because the party is matching. But in a ranked choice voting system, what we find is that it can help voters pick a candidate that more closely matches their policy preferences. It doesn't happen for everyone. It doesn't happen across the board. But the data, there's some evidence to suggest that this is the case. We feel like there's more choice. And so when we do the research on the candidates, we can pick one that more closely or most closely matches our policy preferences. And I think that all three of these are linked with one another. So this is one of the things, especially because we have such a decline in faith in our system, where ranked choice voting can actually be really beneficial. So let's move on to more pros of ranked choice voting. This one is one that's talked about a lot with the two-party system that we have, with the plurality and the first past the post system. This is where third-party candidates cannot flourish. We do not want to waste our vote on a candidate who can't win. And so we pick the candidate of the party that is closest to us or that we identify with, even if we don't particularly care for the candidate. Now, of course, this is at a federal election level in particular. And so we talk about this wasted vote. With a ranked choice voting system, we get rid of that idea of a wasted vote, right? Because let's say there's a candidate that you really like, but you're not sure if they have a chance of winning, but you might rank them first because maybe other people feel the same way as you. And even if they don't, maybe the candidate you rank second, may not be your favorite, but one that you like, one that maybe would be the one you would likely have voted for if it was a plurality system. And so this idea of a wasted vote goes away. That's enticing, right? And we know that this is something that proponents of ranked choice voting are really pushing. And when we are given information about it and we think about it in a way of not wasting a vote anymore, we do tend to increase our whether or not we like ranked choice voting or we want to adopt it. So that's something that's really useful in terms of a pro. I do want to spend just a minute talking about this idea of electability. So this is a word that you may have heard a lot since the 2000 election in particular, 2020 election in particular. Electability is a word that we use to basically what it means is I think a certain type of candidate is most likely to be someone that other people will vote for. So if we look at the 2020 presidential election and Joe Biden as an example, it wasn't that Joe Biden was the first choice candidate for every Democratic primary voter, but the priority was in that election for Democratic voters was to beat President Trump. And so they thought about, well, maybe I like Cory Booker, but I don't think other Democrats will vote for Cory Booker. So I think they'll vote for Joe Biden, and he's the one that's more likely to beat President Trump in a general election. So he's the most electable. I'm going to vote for President Biden in the primary. And the data are very clear that that's actually how he got the nomination in 2020. So the issue is that it's not whether I like a candidate, it's whether I think other people would vote for that person. And so what we tend to end up with is a lot of the same kinds of candidates, either winning a primary or winning a general election. And so there's one of the things that we hear a lot from proponents of ranked choice voting is that women and racial and ethnic minority candidates, third-party candidates, but in particular minoritized candidates, so those who have identities that are not typically represented in government, they're more likely to be elected in a ranked choice voting system, right? Because maybe you do rank them first, maybe other people do the same, or maybe they get ranked second, but with the redistribution, they end up winning. That this electability cycle that we find ourselves in would be gone. We'd have better and more diverse representation in government. That sounds great. The issue, though, I want to bring up that's really important is that the data do not really provide evidence that this happens. So the data that we do have, the research we do have that's been done in the past 2 to 3 years is very inconclusive in whether ranked choice voting systems or those who might be in a ranked choice voting system would be more likely to vote for minoritized candidates. There are all kinds of other things in a system that might make it more likely for a woman or a person of color to run, right? What are the demographics of where they live? What type of election are we talking about? And so to say that ranked choice voting independently would get us out of the electability cycle, there's no evidence to suggest that that is the case. Of course, we need to do more studies, but I just want to be very clear that this is one that we hear a lot, and the evidence is very mixed at best that ranked choice voting would get us out of this electability cycle. I do want to provide a quick example, though, of where this did work. So some of you might be familiar or following the Alaska elections in the past couple of years. And there was a special election where Mary Peltola was able to take the seat, and then she ran in 2022 for the permanent seat and to have it for the full term. And so Alaska adopted a ranked choice voting system. And what we see here in this tabulation is that in the first round, she did not get a majority. She's a Democratic candidate, as you can see here. But the two Republican candidates, they basically split the Republican vote. And so because we have to go to a second round, since nobody got a majority, when the votes were retabulated, Mary Peltola was able to get 55% of the vote and win. Now, there was a lot of misinformation about how this worked and what happened, wasted votes and votes thrown out, and the evidence doesn't suggest that that's the case. But here is an interesting place where we got out of the electability cycle, because she was the first Indigenous Alaskan elected to this at-large House seat. This is the first time. She was also the first Democrat elected to the seat in 49 years. And I'll get to this in a little bit about whether ranked choice voting benefits Democrats, and I'll tell you the little sneak peek is that it does not. But particularly because we have a woman and an Indigenous Alaskan winning a seat for the first time, here is where adopting ranked choice voting did get us out of this electability cycle in this one instance. But because this happened, we've seen immediate pushback. And again, some of you maybe have been following this, that in this election coming up in 2024, there's going to be a referendum in Alaska to get rid of ranked choice voting. So this Alaskans for Honest Elections, they have been running this campaign, and it's mostly Republicans in Alaska who feel like the only reason a Democrat took this seat was because it's a rigged system of ranked choice voting. And so they've gotten through some hurdles with signatures and other things to get on the ballot to get rid of ranked choice voting after only one election cycle of having it. And so when the rules change and the outcomes change, then there's questions over, okay, well, maybe we should go back to the way it was before to maintain a status quo, right? So we've seen this pushback here. Okay, so I just want to move this quickly because I'm having trouble seeing. Here we go. Sorry about that for just 1 second. Okay, so I want to move on here to the cons. What are the cons of ranked choice voting? And I know that I think for those of us that are trying to take a position and figure it out, we hear a lot of pros and not a lot of cons. And so I may spend a little bit more time here just because we hear about them a little bit less. The first thing that we hear is it's complicated, right? That ranked choice voting is very complicated. And because it is complicated, it's going to confuse voters, and it isn't something that we should adopt. And there is some legitimacy to this claim, I will say, because it might seem, as I explained it and as you've all done your research on it, well, yeah, you just rank and redistribute and it happens immediately and it's done. But we are interested voters. We are educated voters. And so it's easier for us, right? Because we're taking the initiative to understand it. But I would like to just draw a quick sort of interesting parallel, at least that came to my mind for any of us who remember the 2000 election, which I'm sure is all of us, and the debacle that was Florida with the butterfly ballots and the 537 votes that basically made George Bush the president. If this was confusing, even with the arrows of where to punch to know for which candidate you are voting, then you look at a ballot like this, which is the main ballot, a sample ballot for the Democratic primary in 2018, with what look like very clear-cut instructions. But this is not a ballot we're used to seeing. It can be confusing. It really can be. And especially because we don't always like to read directions or read instructions. We just kind of move on and think that we know what we're doing. We may not read the instructions at all. And we maybe only pick one candidate and that's it. And so we haven't exhausted all of our options. even with an education campaign before it's adopted or during or after, it is something that's different that we haven't done before, and it can be very complicated. And there's two things that I want to mention here, that for certain voters, this is more challenging than it is for others, and also ways to kind of get around it. So research suggests across, not just Donovan et al., but others, is older voters have a particularly challenging time with ranked choice voting because they find the instructions very difficult. It's not just older voters. I'll talk a little bit later about other voters that find it challenging. But I want to make note of this because older voters are still a disproportionate amount of the electorate. Now, that balance is changing a bit, but if most voters in the electorate would find the instructions difficult, there are consequences for error in the ballots, not voting at all, or not exhausting all of the options on the ballot. The other thing, though, that is clear that's very interesting is that when there is some difficulty understanding ranked choice voting, once voters did it a second time, or before ranked choice voting was adopted, but people who were learning about it, once they went through and learned about it a second time, the difficulty understanding went away. So like with anything else, it's, you know, it's practicing, right? When something changes, it's getting used to it. Again, the issue is that the stakes are quite high in elections, whether it's local or state or federal, but in particularly in local elections, because those are the laws that most intimately affect our lives. And voter turnout is relatively low for local elections as it is. By changing the process and making it more complicated, it could have consequences for voter turnout, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Let's talk more about some of the cons of ranked choice voting, or those who have some cons that we've heard sort of spiraling around or swirling around. One of which is that ranked choice voting disproportionately favors Democratic candidates. And so Tom Cotton, who's a senator from Arkansas, he on Twitter, now X, in August of 2022, he had a series of tweets, and in one of them he said that ranked choice voting, and he was talking about Democrats, is a Democratic scam to win elections. He was railing against the results in Alaska, or the process in Alaska. And he and a lot of other Republican legislators, we hear a lot, and they're cue givers to their voters, saying ranked choice voting is an illegitimate way to elect candidates, to elect people to office. It is all a scam for Democrats to win elections because they can't win them on their own. And I love me some PolitiFact. I love their pants on fire ratings. This is categorically false. There is no evidence. There's no data to suggest in any way that the Democratic Party benefits from ranked choice voting more than the Republican Party. Absolutely not. In Alaska, it just so happened 2 Republicans were running against a Democrat, so they split the support between them, and didn't put the other Republican as a second choice. But that doesn't mean that this is a scam. And so I want to be very clear that when people say like, oh, it's one of the cons of ranked choice voting is that it helps even one party over the other, because it does not even help one party over the other, but particularly it does not help Democratic candidates over Republican candidates. And so that's that pants on fire. So that's not really a con because it's not really a thing. But I do want to talk about a decrease in voter turnout. So across time, we can go all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century when we went to the secret ballot. And then we moved on to primary systems as opposed to the party elites choosing the candidates. When we change an electoral process, we do see a decrease in voter turnout. That's like a real thing across different levels of government and different types of changes of elections. But in particular, there was a study done in 2015 when San Francisco was adopting ranked choice voting, that where they looked at elections where they had it and they didn't over time, there was a decrease in voter turnout. This is a real thing. Now, we don't have updated data in the places where we've seen more adoption because it's new in so many places. But in San Francisco, which is the voters are quite knowledgeable and sophisticated, we did see a decrease in voter turnout. So a concern about changing the electoral process and seeing a decrease in voter turnout is a real one, and a potential con of adopting ranked choice voting. Part of the reason this is the case, and this goes to something I mentioned earlier, is if we go back and think of the states that have adopted ranked choice voting across statewide, so Maine, Alaska, and Hawaii, and I want to take Maine as an example. The reason that these states made these changes, Maine in particular, and that it didn't take long for the voters to get used to it, and that there wasn't a lot of pushback, especially in Maine, is because Maine voters are very sophisticated and knowledgeable. So ranked choice voting works best in places with engaged, educated, sophisticated voters, which is not the majority of the country. And so we think about where to adopt ranked choice voting. Typically, it's most successful in places with a highly engaged, highly knowledgeable electorate. And in places where it's adopted where that's not the case, we're likely to see a precipitous decline in voter turnout, because we are seeing it even in places where, like in San Francisco, for example, where we have a knowledgeable voter base. So that is a real thing, and there's evidence to suggest that we might see and have seen a decrease in voter turnout. And again, with local elections where the turnout's so low to begin with, we have to think about whether adopting it would be worth it if we see a decrease in turnout. So that's one that we really should pay attention to. Just to talk a little bit more about the cons, and this is the big one, and I will end with this actually as the last con before I talk about a few takeaways. It is expensive. So one of the things that we know, and the data are very clear about this in 2018, but we've seen some more updated data, is that in places where ranked choice voting was implemented, the costs were substantially greater than in places that do the plurality or first past the post like we have now. And so in some of the modeling that they did, for anyone that's sort of maybe familiar a little bit with statistics, is they look at what's the mean and then how far away from that value do we see this distribution of spending. And it was like, we say 5 standard deviations, which is very far. So in other words, in places with ranked choice voting, they were spending statistically significantly more than in places that were not. One of the things that we will hear when people talk about the expense is, okay, but in a system where we have a runoff that it doesn't happen immediately, it's really expensive to hold a second election. That's fair, but there's not a lot of places where that's the case. Or you might hear, well, campaigning is less expensive in a ranked choice voting system than not, and so that offsets cost. The data don't really bear that out either. It really is more expensive to have a ranked choice voting system. And most of the costs, or let me say it in a different way, the level of government that spends to implement elections and run elections is the county and the city, some state funding, and some federal funding. So most of the cost is going to sit with the local municipalities. So we think again about whether it's going to be adopted in Naperville, the cost is going to be absorbed by the residents because typically it's through taxpayer money, and it has to be figured into the budget. So I did a little bit of digging, and it was a little bit challenging to find, and it's not perfect, but I did a little bit of digging. To give an example before we get to Illinois. So Nevada is going to be adopting ranked choice voting, and they've estimated already before they can do this in 2026, they've spent $3.2 million across the state. And then on average, it's going to be about $57,000 a year moving forward. Okay. And so you look at this and it may not be that much. $57,000 a year might not be that much. But they've already shelled out a lot of money. And so these are just some data that we have so far. This comes from the Nevada Legislative Council. But if we think about in terms of Illinois, because we're talking about us, the DuPage County's fiscal year 2024 election budget is $8.8 million. That's a lot. And honestly, if we look at it's about $2.5 billion across the country that local governments spend in an election cycle to run an election or to run elections. So if you divide it out, it actually 8.8 is not that much compared to other places. But if DuPage County is already allocating $8.8 million to run an election, and now we're going to implement ranked choice voting, we think about how much more money that's going to cost, because it's not just the running of the election. We have to train the election workers. We have to make sure that the ballots, because we have to reprint them all, we have to have new software and all of that. It's also voter education. So it's educating the voters before the election. It's making sure that the poll workers can help the people who are in-person voting through the ballots. But even those maybe who are doing mail-in, we have to make sure they know what they're doing if we're talking about more than just a local election. But it's also the education after. And so it's really difficult to nail down, because there are not a lot of places that use ranked choice voting, what the estimate would be on how much more it would cost. But we know that for those localities that do use it, that it is substantially more expensive. And again, because there's a little bit of money that comes from the state and a little bit of money that does come from the federal government. And especially the Biden administration has rolled out more money for states because of issues related to like mail-in ballots and cybersecurity and things like that. The money only goes so far. So the cost is a real concern, and something that we're still trying to figure out through the data what this looks like, but it would be more expensive. So what we know, because of all these pros and cons, but particularly those cons that I mentioned, is there's not widespread support for adopting ranked choice voting. We definitely see different voters feeling differently about it, which makes it really hard to come to consensus to even adopt the system in the first place. Almost every study that's been done on this so far, you can see all the citations I have here, that even when voters are given more information about a ranked choice voting system, they still prefer the current system we have, the first past the post single vote plurality system. And it doesn't mean that they wouldn't like it if they had it, because maybe they would. But when they're told about it and they're comparing to the system we have now, overall, a majority of those that they talk to, the voters prefer the system we have now. It's really, really hard to undo that because their preferences are pretty set that way. But also, part of this, for those who do like it, it's a certain type of voter, younger voters who are more disenfranchised with the system and have less experience voting. Democrats also like it because they think it benefits their party over the other, which again, the data do not bear that out. More educated voters like it because, as I mentioned before, the more engaged and educated the voter, the more likely this is to work in the first place. This would make sense. Third-party supporters, they all have higher support. Oh, excuse me, I have a typo in my slides. I do apologize. The older voters goes underneath. I do apologize for that. But they have a higher support for ranked choice voting overall. In terms of those who are less supportive, and again, I apologize for my typo here, older voters, because it is more challenging for them, as I mentioned, because Republicans think it doesn't benefit them, those who are less educated, and those who are very tied to their party. We see the sort of mirror flip, right, of those who like it and those who do not. It's really hard to bring all those people together. And so any campaign across a state or in a city or a locality that's trying to figure out how to adopt it, how do you create a message that resonates with all of these voters? One that really does provide all of the information. It can be a big, big challenge. And so I just have 3 takeaways just to sort of talk about and then we can move through, and I would love to have a discussion about it. 3 things that I would just like you to take away, if nothing else, from the information I've provided. The first thing is that, oh my gosh, excuse me, I got another typo. I am so sorry. Ranked choice voting is not a oh no, that's actually not a typo. It's not a magic bullet to fix all that ails our electoral system. That was what I meant to say. If we feel like minoritized candidates are not getting elected, if we feel like women are not getting elected, if we feel like third-party candidates are not getting elected, ranked choice voting is not the thing that's going to fix it. There are layers and structures in place that perpetuate a system where the same kind of people get elected, and that the two-party system perpetuates and maintains itself. But ranked choice voting is not going to be the magic bullet that fixes all of this. It may be part of a fix, but it is not the end-all be-all that's going to fix everything that ails our system. The other thing, though, is that ranked choice voting is learnable. When people learn about it, when they have more practice with it, and with sustained education, people can get used to it, just like any other type of change to a structure. People can get used to it, but sustained education is critical and also expensive. And then the last thing is, when we hear about better representation, whether it's policy matching, as I mentioned before, or again, more diverse representation to get us out of this electability cycle, as I said, the evidence don't really bear that out. It's mixed at best. And even though people say they have better experiences or they have positive experience with ranked choice voting as opposed to a negative experience, there's so much research that needs to be done still as we adopt it more and we know more of the types of questions to ask to see whether or not the things that people say ranked choice voting actually does, whether that happens or not. And so we have to just be a little bit careful with some of those things. So that's my pitch on the pros and cons. I really appreciate the attention. And I look forward to conversation. Susan, should I stop sharing? Because then I can see everybody.
Yeah, why don't you stop sharing?
Okay.
Then you can see
Yeah.
everyone. And we also have some excellent questions in the
Great.
chat. So, of course, Naperville, for our municipal elections, we have 2 counties.
Mm.
If ranked choice voting were to be implemented in Naperville, how would we handle the logistics of Naperville voters living, well, in 2 counties, some in one, some in the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, just going to the Naperville City building where I vote, I got to make sure I follow the signs in my DuPage and my will, you know, it's the whole thing. So, and this actually, I will say that one of the things I tried to find, because I was able to find the DuPage County budget for elections. I couldn't find this for Will County for their fiscal year 24, because I wanted to see what is Will spending and kind of how does that work. And so, because the city is split over 2 counties, if the city decides that it is going to adopt ranked choice voting, then the counties, both counties are going to have to adjust. And so that means that there's going to be an increase in the budget for both. And it would be, it's a way we can't split it up where like only this county does it or only this county does it if the city decides to adopt it. And so that means it's an increased spending across both counties.
How would mail-in ballots be affected?
Yeah, this is a great question, especially because we've seen such an increase in mail-in ballots that was happening before 2020, but of course since then. And this is where voter education is so important, right? Because already for any of us who have requested a mail-in ballot or filled it out, there's a good amount of instructions already about how to do it, how to seal it, where is the barcode, where is your signature, right? All of that is already a lot of instructions to follow. There'd be an additional set of instructions that would have to be, I would argue, even more detailed than an in-person ballot, because there's nobody like a poll worker to walk you through it if you have questions. I mean, now the good thing is you could Google some things, but we know Google is not always great. So there would have to be such intention with really explaining piece by piece and even a sample perhaps of how you would fill in the bubbles like we do already. But this would also potentially require, which I think might be an issue, 2 types of ballots to be printed, one for mail-in with more explicit instructions and one for in-person with less explicit instructions. I don't advocate for that because there's all kinds of things people could say about the ballots are inequitable. Some people have a benefit. So it's really tricky, I think, to figure out how do you provide the appropriate instructions for someone who's not standing there with a poll worker helping them.
So, here's another question. Would the full result, including the breakdown of the redistributed votes, be made public? So in places where this happens, do they make all of that public so you can see?
They do. And I think Alaska here is a great example where, and in local elections, they would do the same. There has to be full transparency, right? I mean, we know this with elections. In order for us to feel like it's legitimate and the process works, there would have to be a breakdown where you can see across and how many redistributions did it take to get to the 50% threshold. All that would be public and all that would be available for us to see.
So what about the complexity here in Naperville? For example, we elect 4 candidates for city council at a time.
Yep.
So your example is easy if you're just trying to elect one person.
Yes. Yeah. How would you do that when already you vote for more than one, right? This is one of the challenges with local elections. This is where we don't talk about this with federal because you pick one, right? So I think there's a couple of interesting things here. One would be, and I think in a good way, that hopefully it would then mean more candidates would run, right? That more candidates would run because already we get a good amount. But if you can rank, let's say, we elect 4 candidates for something, maybe 16 to 20 people would run. Now that's a lot for voters to keep track of and to do all of their due diligence to see for whom to vote. But the hope would be that more people would run. It would be, here's the thing. If you vote let me say it in a different way. If we have to elect 4 people and only 4 people run, then they all win. Right? So that's sort of easy, but not in a good way. But when more than 4 people run, you'd have to provide that ranking, just like we would do for just one person. And the people who get the most votes of those 4 we would never get to a majority. Like it's impossible, right? You could never get to a majority. And so there'd have to be, and with ranked choice voting, even though for the examples we gave, they get to a majority, for some, they may not be able to, and they have to figure out what that threshold would be where people get knocked out and then it gets redistributed.
So that would be a decision that the
It would be,
community
yes, yes, yes.
and that decision might be different depending on how many candidates there were.
It would be interesting to see how that decision would be made. Is it just that a hard and fast rule that X%? But again, to your point, depending on how many candidates run and how many openings there are, that number may not always be the same. And so this is something I would have to do more research on, and the election official, the county clerk and those who run the elections would have to think about.
You talked about the downturn in voter turnout. Yeah. Does it tend to rebound?
It does, but it takes a while. That's a great question. That it takes a couple of election cycles for it to come back up again. And not that that's, I guess we can look at it two ways. That's not necessarily bad, because at least people come back to the franchise. But if there are certain types of people who are opting out and only some type of people who are staying in, then that does affect the types of candidates who are going to win and the types of policies that are going to be implemented. So there can be real consequences if certain types of people are opting out and in that interim period until they come back in.
So we have a question. Does this mean throwing out our existing voting machines? Now, my understanding is that both Will and DuPage counties have new equipment.
Yes.
That could, in principle, manage ranked choice voting, but
yes.
that they do not necessarily have the software required.
That's exactly right. And just looking a little bit at the budget breakdown, that software is expensive. When I was looking on the county clerk website, that one of the most considerable costs, because to your point, the voting machines have been updated, it's the software that's expensive. And so now that's sort of a one-time cost, right? You pay for the software and then you can use it for subsequent elections, but the software would have to be updated. And that is a considerable cost.
Now, we're fortunate in our counties that we do have new equipment, but certainly that's not true in every county of Illinois.
That's exactly right. And so even though Illinois has adopted and spent more money in recent years to update voting equipment and machines and cybersecurity and things across the state, those with more revenue can afford it and have a higher budget, like our counties, right? And so we already know that the access to the ballot is so inequitable across different places. And so that's another thing about where ranked choice voting is likely to be adopted. The more engaged, the more educated voter, the more sophisticated voter, they tend to be in places where the taxes are higher. And so they have the means to implement some of these things in ways. But it would be, if this were adopted statewide, this would be a huge problem for places that wouldn't have the means to do it.
So you talked about the higher initial costs. You just talked about the software. Do those initial costs go down over time?
So that's a great,
continue to be somewhat more expensive.
So that's a great question. It depends, right? So because this is new, we're just getting a little bit more information about this. Once the machines are updated, if they haven't been already, once the software is updated, once the election workers are trained, the poll workers are trained, even though that's iterative, and it becomes more customary, the cost would level off until better software came out. And then they would have to update it again, right? And the other thing too, like we look at Alaska, where they updated all of this to be able to have ranked choice voting. And then what if they roll it back in the 2024 election and then they go back to plurality? Then they got to go backwards again. And so this bouncing back and forth potentially in some places could create costs that would go back and forth as well.
We have a question about ballot types and ballot styles.
Yeah.
So does the whole ballot need to be ranked choice voting? Or what if you're just doing the mayor and council ranked choice voting, but other things are on there and they're not? How does that play out?
You can pick and choose which, depending on the law in your state, you can pick and choose which offices are ranked choice and which are not. And so this gets in the weeds a little bit for some of the states that have and places that have adopted this, where like all statewide races are ranked choice voting, but like the presidential election is not ranked choice voting, right? So yeah, there can be like picking and choosing which ones, and that can be tricky and challenging to figure out which ones, right? And lack of consensus over which ones.
So another question about the two counties. What would be, so right now, I vote and they add up the Will County and the DuPage County. So, sometimes if you're really watching, you have to add those numbers up yourself to see who's in the lead and who's winning. It seems with ranked choice voting, all those calculations so a single candidate, could be one in Will County and 5 in DuPage. Right. That seems
it has to be merged, right? Because if it's every voter, regardless of county, that's voting for a particular office, they have to merge all of that together and do the rankings and redistributions with them together as opposed to separately. And so again, I mean, tabulating ranked choice voting ballots does take longer, obviously. And there's also like checking to make sure the redistribution is done correctly. So it can take longer. There is a time element to that, but they have to merge the counties together and then do the redistributions.
So that requires a lot of collaboration.
It does.
Both counties and both election divisions.
It absolutely does. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. If a voter leaves one candidate and ranks only 3, is the ballot useless or is it still counted?
It is counted. You do not have to rank every candidate. You could just rank 1. You can only rank 3 out of 7. You don't have to rank every candidate in order for your ballot to be valid. Is that the question?
Yes, I believe that's the question.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
All right. Going back to how it would be implemented in Naperville. Wouldn't there be proportional ranked choice voting? From my understanding, that doesn't change the ballot from the voter's end. It just changes the math behind the distribution.
Well, it changes. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. It changes the ballot in the way in the ranking, right? It's not just pick one. It's ranking of all of the candidates. But the voter doesn't do anything with the tabulation or the proportion. That all happens with the workers, with those who are implementing the election. Maybe I missed the question.
It's a little complicated. If that person wants to clarify,
I'm sorry if I did not understand that. I apologize.
Sorry, I just meant like just like ranked choice voting, you rank all the candidates, but proportional ranked choice voting looks the same as regular ranked choice voting as well.
Yes, it does. Yes. I'm sorry, I understand now. It does, yes.
Thank you. Isn't it true that an advantage of ranked choice voting is that electioneering becomes more positive? Campaigns tend to avoid attacking opponents because if their candidate doesn't get a majority, they want to encourage people to make them their second choice.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I was going to put it in the presentation because that's something we typically hear as a pro for ranked choice voting is it's more civil. And we look at some of the higher profile elections like the New York City mayor and others where it seemed more civil. But I will just note that the research on this and the data are mixed at best on whether this is the case. Logically, it would make sense that I don't want to go to take another candidate to task and I don't want to come across too negative because I want to try to get every single voter I can possibly get because I want to come in second for some people. But we just don't have enough evidence to suggest that that's actually happening across every election. We need to see more of whether that would be the case. It's a potential benefit, but we haven't seen results that it's happening everywhere.
Would ranked choice voting encourage candidates to band together in campaigning to encourage voters to vote for them 1 and 2?
Yeah, it's this idea of like running as a slate almost that, but the thing is there's still one winner, right? And that's where that gets a little tricky is that the banding together could be more like we agree not to run negative campaigns against one another because I also want to be second in case I can win. And, we want to be first or second so one of us can win, but there's still only one winner. And so you still want to be benefited and advantaged over every other candidate. So banding together insofar as maybe they would say, hey, put this guy second or put this woman second might be useful. But without a multi-winner system, it doesn't maybe make much sense to do it that way because there's still only one winner.
But if we're electing 4
Oh, for that type, I'm so sorry. Yes, for if you're talking about when we vote for more than one in the, yes, I'm so sorry. Then maybe, yes, that idea of like running as a slate in some ways would be beneficial. Yes.
So in the few cities who have chosen ranked choice voting, do you have any statistics on how the expense is shared between city and counties?
I have tried to find this. It's such a great question. So the data are so sparse, and there's some states that report this. There's I think 26 states that have reported this, but that's across states that don't have ranked choice voting. And so trying to parse it out of where the cost is disproportionately borne. The only thing I can say is because of the way all elections are rolled out, regardless of ranked choice versus plurality, is that the counties and the municipalities absorb most of the cost. And so I would presume that that would be the same, unless the state or the federal government, in an attempt to try to get more places to roll out ranked choice voting, provided some grants. We know the Biden administration wrote out grants after the 2020 election, after COVID, because of the necessity for more mail-in ballots and things like that. But there's not a lot of political capital to gain from trying to get ranked choice voting spread across the country. So I don't know if that would happen.
These have been great questions. We clearly have a very engaged audience tonight.
It's great.
Does anybody have any other questions? This has been an education for all of us. I love the pros and cons and all of the details. Dr. Chod, thank you very much for speaking with us tonight.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this event and appreciate the community and civic work of the League of Women Voters of Naperville, I hope you'll consider joining us, or in any case, join us at a future Ideas Forum. You can go to our website for more information. Thank you for our presenter and to all the great questions in our audience tonight. Good evening.
Thank you all so much. Take care.